welcome back. Today we're doing something kind of special to me that I'm really excited about, and we are answering some questions about the Kingdom of Edirann, because as of today, the Kingdom of Edirann has been shared somewhere on the internet, one form or another, for 10 years. It is a decade old, and I've rebuilt it, I think at this point, maybe 6 times, and each time it gets a little bit more intricate, a little bit more detailed, and I just want to talk about that. So, to begin with, the Kingdom of Edirann started as a Royal Kingdom challenge. It's a fairly simple challenge. You have your royal family, you have like three noble families, 2 merchant families, and then like 3 peasant families, and you go from there. I very quickly wasn't following the rules, I will admit. But we'll start with the king and queen. We had the Kentons as the royal family. I was leaning into, I think Welsh naming conventions, I can't remember. But we had Cynric and Leoftig. Now, Cynric was the king. You can see in this picture here, there is a forbidden object, but ignore it. And Leoftig was his wife, who was kind of fairy-ish. I gave her this kind of weird makeup, and I had the idea that maybe she had like some interesting ancestry, but at that point I had no supernaturals within the game. Now, I'm showing you a family tree here. You can see they had their oldest daughter, son Gifu. At that point, I was marrying basically princesses to other kingdoms, so to speak, which is what makes sense, but how I did it in game was I would find a townie at random, just pick a townie, marry her to that townie, and then move them to a separate neighborhood and give them prisoner tokens, which I often forgot to give them, but I would give them prisoner tokens so that we wouldn't see them anymore, but there could still be relationships. And I rolled kind of off-screen for children and things like that. But during my first rebuild, I kind of stopped doing that because I felt like maybe it was causing crashing and problems like that. And so I added some of them back who made it basically through dice rolls, and Son Gifu was one of them. She came back, I believe, as an elder with her daughter Ava, because the Flenley family in my head had just kind of been toppled and there was no sons. So Ava married Edward Flenley, and they have Sinra and Edwin as their children. The problem there being that Ava is incredibly resentful that Edward basically signed away her rights to any sort of claim in Edirann. And it's complicated because Edirann was, when it was ruled by the Kenton family, was called Gallivud. I never really liked that name. It meant for it to be a placeholder, but it just stuck, and then I just didn't like it. And so when the war happened, Arndt Blumenthal basically remade the kingdom, gave it a new name, reorganized everything, and so really tried to erase any claim that the Kenton family would have on Edirann. But it was kind of complicated. Now up next was their second daughter, Egild, who also married outside of the kingdom. This is her here having a bit of a dalliance, but I forgot to give her a prisoner token, so she showed up a lot. She actually is Bernique's mother. So she married, I can't remember his first name, but it's a townie with the last name Barrett. And it was a very Rococo, Marie Antoinette, like, going down with the ship kind of dynasty, which they did. Especially after Bernique married Arndt Blumenthal, things really took a turn for the worse, and her brothers are now deceased. So, like, it was a whole thing. But we never actually got to see Egild once she married outside of the kingdom. She did die a queen of that dynasty. So, finally, the Kentons did have a son, and that was Cadfael. You can see him here. He's got his little crown as an elder. He was a crown prince for a very long time. Cynric didn't die for a while, and so Cadfael was really frustrated, very Prince Charles vibes, like he just wanted to rule, and he felt like he was never going to get to, and he would die, and then his son would get to rule, and he was the one that was leading Gallivyd, which was the kingdom at the time, when war broke out, which was due to a random occurrence scenario. We are going to talk about that, but I'm just somebody wanted a deep dive on the family, so I'm trying to share as much as I can about the Kenton family. So Cadfael's wife was Maurice Kenton. She was actually the oldest Van Allsburg daughter, and she's still important to the story today because after the whole war happened, basically she had land set aside as her dowry. So Arndt Blumenthal, because she was very beloved as a queen, she never wanted to be queen, but she was very good at it. Arndt Blumenthal agreed that as long as she and her grandchildren agreed to forsake any claim to the land, any claim to the throne, that she could go live on this property. And they did so, and she took Cledwyn and Diega and a couple other people, but she went to this land, and it is now Penrith, which is kind of a city on its own. It's not attached to any sort of kingdom, it's sort of no man's land. And it's really interesting to see that dynamic there of they just got thrown there, they had no infrastructure, nothing. And they made the best of it, but it was really because Maurice was so appreciated as a person that even Arndt Blumenthal, who hated the Kenton family, was yeah, I don't actually want to do her harm. So she was an important lady. Lastly, the final child of the second generation for the Kenton family was Aelfric. Fun fact, I did use weird character names for this family for a while before I was you know what? This is too much. And so I corrected them, but he founded the first Knights Order. When I realized, I don't really know what to do with the second son situation. I didn't really want to introduce religion at that point. So he founded the Knights, and that's when I made up a lot of early decisions involving my knights, which they've developed, but basically, once they were a knight, they were not supposed to get married at any point. I have changed it slightly since then, but for the most part, this is where my spares end up, just so that I have something to do with them that still makes sense in the story. Obviously, he's no longer in the story, but he deserves a mention. Okay, so now we're on the third generation of the Kenton family. I'm not going to talk about Bernique's children because they are featured in the current version of the story. They are, of course, the Blumenthal children, Arndt Blumenthal's children, so we know about them, but we don't really know necessarily so much about this part of the Kenton family. Now, they had a daughter called Affanin. They had the crown prince, Alwyn, and they had a second son, Anirin. After the war, Anirin ended up jailed, Alwyn died, and Affanin had again married outside of the kingdom, because that's just what I did with my princesses at that point. Although I will say she was a bit of an exception, because she ended up having two husbands. Originally, she married Bruce Rauscher, who is a townie. They had a daughter called Madison, and then she married Ulfric Svensson, which was just a sim that I had made, and I plunked him down. But they didn't have any children, and we never really see Madison at this point. She's just not part of the story or the world. It's possible her children could come up, but it's very separate. I do kind of think of... I have a save called Hreindal, which is very Viking themed, and I always imagine that Affanin and Ulfric rule over that neighborhood, so we might potentially see her in the future. I did give her as well Leofdig's magic makeup, because I was really at that point wanting to add a bit of supernatural stuff in, but I never really defined it. So we know the Kenton family has something going on, but we don't know what. And yeah. Up next, we have Alwyn, who was married to the lovely Sia. She is still alive in the current story, but she was the third generation spouse, and she was a ward of the Van Allsburg family, but she wasn't genetically related to them. Basically, they wanted to adopt a bunch of kids, but I didn't want a family where everybody was related, so I came up with the idea of them taking in wards, which was a medieval practice, so it made sense. And yeah, so we had Sia. Together, they had 3 children, Cledwyn, Diega, and finally Taliesin, who are all characters in the story. During the war, Cledwyn actually ended up blinded, and him and Diega lived with Maurice Kenton in Penrith, kind of as exiles. Taliesin, at the time, wasn't born, so his mother escaped with the help of some knights, basically, and she escaped, had her son, and so he still technically has a claim to the throne, which is why when Tenby, which is basically a magical little village in the woods, was discovered, it was kind of a problem, because this faction, essentially, of the Kenton family, specifically Taliesin, had never given away his rights to the land that Edirann was built on. So he could be a claimant to the throne. And that's why it was arranged for him to become an archduke and to marry Arndt Blumenthal's second daughter, Katinka, just as a way to kind of ensure that there wasn't going to be a problem in the future. He didn't have to give away his rights, but Arndt Blumenthal also doesn't have to worry because he's being married into his family. His daughter will have those children. It'll be okay. So that was a recent kind of upset thing that happened with them. Of course, there is one more child from this particular line of the Kenton family, specifically Alwyn. He visited Severia Drago, who was a St. Persephone nun, which is basically where my female romance sims can go and live their best lives, but their children are considered legitimate. Like, they're called luck babies. They can be adopted out to members of the community, or they can go live with their father and are considered valid part of the inheritance. Like, there's no scandal necessarily associated with them. So Alwyn and Severia had a son, which was a secret, because Severia wasn't sure how she wanted to play that. But then the war happened, and she knew her son was in a lot of danger, being a valid Kenton heir. So she basically gave him to Tippy Dawn, and Tippy Dawn escaped and claimed that he was her son as well. Recently, Severia was kind of making moves to see if she couldn't get him back, because he is, again, very valuable as a chess piece, even though he's just a teenage boy. And he ran away from the brothel that he was raised in, and we're kind of gonna follow him and see what happens with him, but he is yet another loose end that Arndt Blumenthal is not aware of. There are quite a few, but this is one that he doesn't know about and nobody really knows about. But physically speaking, he does have very Kenton facial features. I talk about the Kenton face a lot in my Medieval Color Legacy Challenge because I used basically Cynric and Leofdig, but reimagined them to be my Devereux family. And those facial features are distinct, so we'll have to see what happens with him. Now, speaking of complications and loose ends, while Edirann was imprisoned, he was very sick. He was severely wounded in the war, and it was clear he probably wasn't going to make it. He was cared for by a servant girl called Rosie Middleham, and she just had the biggest, hugest crush on him. She just adored him. And in normal circumstances, she probably wouldn't have been someone that he was attracted to, but when you're alone and you're sick and you kind of know you're dying, he took the comfort where he could, and they ended up sleeping together, and she got pregnant. And so, of course, she kind of panicked and was helped to basically marry him to legitimize the baby, but also then smuggled out of Edirann and went to Penrith and basically moved in with Maurice and had a son, which, of course, is yet another complication. And unfortunately, it's a complication that Arndt Blumenthal is aware of, because obviously she kind of fled, and he's like, where's the nursemaid kind of thing. But there wasn't much he could do about it, and so she gave birth to Selin. Selin is now a child, and she since has remarried and has never officially come forward with claiming Selin is Aniran's son, but he also very much looks like a Kenton, and he also is a redhead like his dad, and he could be a clone of him. So it's a little tough at the moment, especially because his stepfather is Brigham von Augsburg, who was a knight and who was very dedicated to the Kenton family. And now that him and Rosie have a son, Girion, he's kind of almost forcing like responsibility for Selen's safety on the younger son, Girion, which again, it's really complicated. And Arndt Blumenthal hasn't officially decided what to do about Selen. He's so far down the totem pole. And also, Rosie would have to like prove legitimacy and prove that she had been married to Edirann, because she's not a Saint Persephone nun. If she can't prove she was married, then Selen's kind of just a bastard, and so he's further down the line than these other claimants, so it would be really difficult for him. Yeah, it's a mess, because that's what my Sims love to do. And that's really it for the 4th generation of the Kenton family, although as you can see here, the 5th generation has entered the chat. This is Eadburga. She is Diega and Jeremy Oriel's firstborn daughter, and she's really interesting. She kind of has broken the Kenton face curse a little bit, and I'm really excited to see kind of what happens to her. Now, she does not have a claim to the throne because her mother signed away those rights, but she does have Kenton blood, and that's always going to be a problem for Arndt Blumenthal, who holds such a grudge against the family. But, you know, for now she's a cute little toddler, and I'm enjoying her antics. Of course, there is part of the Kenton family that I haven't talked about yet, and that is way back to the 1st generation, where the king, Cynric, had an ongoing affair. He had a mistress, and her name was Ilaria Fiore. Now, she was a peasant sim, like, it didn't really matter so much, but they did have 2 children together, and those children, and also her children with a separate sim, have since gotten into they're entangled in the mess. This is kind of an older version of the family tree, but as you can see, they had a son. His name is Amadeo. He later married Madeline, and they had a daughter called Augustina, a son called Bertoldo Fiore, who did die, and Cesarina. And now Cesarina has children, and Augustina has Iolanda, and Amadeo has adopted Belladonna, but for a while there, Arndt Blumenthal was really paranoid. So in order to keep Amadeo in control as well as his children, Madeline was imprisoned for quite a long time, and when she came out, her husband had adopted this strange child, so she really doesn't like Belladonna. Her children were gone, like, it was really difficult for her, and she was always afraid of her husband's blood kind of causing issues for their family, and it has in some ways, although in other ways it kind of hasn't, because they have never tried to make any sort of claims to the throne. They are bastard children, so like it would be difficult for them in the first place, and none of them wants to. Amadeo never wanted any sort of leadership position. He's all about his family. Augustina just wants to run a tavern and run it well. Cesarina just cares about her family. Bertoldo unfortunately did pass, so like they aren't really trying anything, but now they're having children, and the question is what's going to happen with those children if they do discover their parentage and their history, so to speak. Of course, because Ilaria was known to have slept with Cynric, like it wasn't a super duper big secret, she also had an affair with Earl Aldrich Bellamy and had twins, Bettina and Corrado, but they didn't have DNA tests, so Art was very paranoid after he won the war. Bettina did end up becoming part of the nobility. Matas had passed at that point, but Corrado, again, to control him, he was actually imprisoned, and his wife was left free, but she passed away before he was actually let out. He was kept until he was an elder. So he has 2 children, Alvida and Brigitte. And then, of course, you can see Bettina has had children as well, but it caused problems. Cordo was very bitter for a very long time, and I think he's still bitter because his whole life was kind of taken from him, even though everyone knew that he was a Bellamy bastard, not a Kenton bastard. It's still just the suspicion that he could have been caused problems. And that's really it for the Kenton family. This is just a fun set of graphics that I did showing the heights of all of their current surviving ancestors. So this is an update on the Long children as well. Also body types, kind of what they would look like if I used them. But, as I said, the Blumenthal family is kind of entwined with the Kenton family at this point. They can't be separate because Arndt Blumenthal, in order to strengthen his position, married a woman descended directly from the Kenton family. And he kind of ignores that part in his head, but it is kind of a problem. So now that we've covered the Kentons, I do want to kind of get into the Blumenthal family as well as the war that kind of made them royalty. So we'll start with the war. At the time before the war, Arndt was part of the Blumenthal family. They were peasant class. Specifically at the time, I treated peasants as indentured, and they were kind of known for quarrying and mining. And he had a lot of ideals. He specifically had an interesting lifetime want that led to this. But essentially what happened is 7 years ago, I got a random occurrence scenario for the neighborhood. I usually just did one of those and it would impact the whole neighborhood, and I got war. And at first I was really nervous about it. I thought about re-rolling, and then I was like, this could be really fun. And there is a Tumblr post detailing everything that I did in terms of the war, but the gist of it was I rolled a lot of dice. I took a d6 and I rolled to determine how long it would be. That ended up being 2 years kind of in their world. And then I rolled a d4 to determine what the scenario was. Because the way I figured it, there could be a revolt involving the peasants, there could be a rebellion involving nobles, they could be attacked by outside forces, or they could be attacking outside forces. What ended up winning, again completely at random, was a peasant revolt. And I was happy about it, because I already kind of, at that point, was like, I know who could lead this if that's what wins. And when it did, I had Arndt Blumenthal. Because he was already set up to be really angry, really rebellious, worried about what being indentured meant for his family and his sisters. I was going to randomize that, but it was just too perfect. And so that was going to be my peasant leader. That was who was leading this revolt. And then I rolled again to see who was going to win. And the peasants won. So then I had to figure out what the heck was going to happen. Arndt did have a lifetime want to become king, which is funny because he's very idealistic. He was talking so much about how he hated the Kentons because they indentured families, they arranged marriages without asking, yada yada yada, but he still wanted to be a king. So then I went through every single household and I rolled to see which side they had been on during the war, just to kind of start official sides, because I felt like it would also break up the families a bit, because at this point I had several households that were Bellamys, that were O'Neills, that were Dragos, so it's possible to kind of have strife within. I had my Kenton loyalists, I had my rebels, and then at that point I got to decide, okay, where is everybody now? What happened to them based on their choices? And I also did include the outside families Kenton princesses had married into, like the Barretts and the Rauschers, just to see, and they both sided with the rebels. The Flenleys did as well. Again, all random, but still. And then I also included St. Persephone's and the Order of Zeus, which were both religious houses, just to kind of see. And St. Persephone's was a Kenton loyalist, so that's why their kind of, not monastery, I don't know what to call it, cloister, is kind of run down and doesn't get a lot of funding because they helped the Kenton family during the war. So different families were rewarded, there was punishment, and I just kind of went through, but I also needed to decide, who survives, who gets injured, who dies, what are the punishments, and I rolled up for all of it again. And there was a lot of punishments, obviously. I kind of judged a little bit to case-by-case basis in terms of, were they just free? Did they become nobles? What happened for the people who sided with Arndt? And yeah, there was a lot of injuries. There was a lot of sad deaths, unfortunately. I'm trying to look to see, what some of the sadder ones. There was some R-wording. I don't really want to say it because YouTube doesn't like the word, but if you look up this particular link that I'm going to link to, that word is mentioned, just so you know. Things were tough for people, and it might surprise you seeing some of the names on what sides and what happened. Cledwyn specifically was severely injured, and so that's why he's blind, which Arndt Blumenthal did not specifically order. That was just soldiers that kind of did it. The Jung family became dukes, which was a huge leap because they had also been indentured. I rolled for who escaped and who was exiled, and it was a lot. It was a lot. Very few people ended up actually being executed. Elfric was executed. He was a knight. He was part of the escape that freed Sia. And he also made an attempt on Arndt's life. Alwyn was executed. Bertoldo was executed. Karsten Heydrich turned his coat in the middle of the war because he was kind of cunning and sketchy, and so he got put to death. And then Magdalene O'Neill and Walt Stafford because they were helping escapees. Some people just died during the war, not even related to the war, but a small child drowned and somebody got trampled, there was a fire, infection, that sort of thing. Kind of sad, kind of morbid, but here we are. I decided on alleys, things like that, and I just kind of went from there, and it really made for such a fun, interesting gameplay. I think until that happened, I was kind of losing interest in Edirann a little bit, which was Gallivant, but I don't know if I would have stuck with it. But that made it so much fun, and so that's why we're at present day with Arndt as a king. He is married to Bernique, who is a princess twice over, really, and they have their little family, but they're still dealing with traces of the war. Lastly, somebody did ask about Salome's situation. Salome being Arndt Blumenthal's oldest daughter, who is the crown princess, was kind of the heir for the longest time before Isidore was born. She was one of 3 girls, and then of course finally the son was born, and it felt like the world had stopped in many ways for Salome. Outwardly, she acted like it was fine, that, of course her brother would rule, but she is very bitter about that, and there is some resentment. And now, of course, her younger sister has recently been betrothed to an archduke, but nothing's happening with Salome. And I really think she feels that, and she's taking that a bit personally, that she hasn't had her future decided for her. The future she was going to have was stolen from her, and now she's got Ava Flenley in her ear going, that's so unfair. That happened to me too. This sucks. And so I don't honestly know where it's going to go. I'm very much basing it on what Salome does in game. I allow gameplay a lot of times to just kind of direct me and guide me, or if I get inspired, obviously I'll change things, but I will say somebody had asked what my favorite detail built into Edirann was, and Salome is currently going through that, and that is the cloister system, where all Sims, regardless of station, when they're a teenager, 5 days from becoming an adult, they go to either the men's cloister or the female cloister, which is not a religious house. It is run by a specific subset of nuns, but it's actually just meant to kind of, it was Arndt Blumenthal's way of like easing the guilt of like he became a king rather than there being like a democracy. And so the idea is everyone of every class, every station goes into the cloister. They are treated the same. They all dress the same. They do the same sort of work. They are encouraged to be friendly with each other and to build bonds so that they have a better understanding of how the other classes and stations live and think. And it's meant to be a very forward-thinking thing, but it is one of my favorite details just because I feel like I don't know, Arndt would feel bad. So that was my way of like showing his turmoil over taking something that he really wanted, even though he talked a big game about how royalty was kind of bad. And his whole grudge with the Kentons was that they had an entire indentured servant class. Like these people he felt were the backbone of their society and weren't appreciated, were never freed unless they managed to get enough money to do so. Whereas the indentured servants now within Edirann are only indentured to the crown, not to specific noble families. They don't just kind of grab up everybody they can in order to have free labor. It's a lot better than it was in some ways, but also a lot worse. So yeah, I'm honestly really excited about the drama Salome could potentially cause. There's so much potential, and it just, gotta see what she does. I have thought about doing a bachelor challenge for her just to see, because for a long time my plan ended up being that I was going to find another simmer who plays a medieval game and have her kind of go to their game and marry someone from their game, because I thought it'd be a fun way to kind of cross-pollinate. I don't know, just to connect. But now I really want to keep her in my game, so we're gonna have to see what happens with her. But anyways, I'm exhausted at this point of talking, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching my videos, for supporting me, for really getting involved and engaged with my Tumblr and the Kingdom of Edirann specifically. I have so much fun telling that story and creating things. And there were some more questions specifically about like deities and religions that I don't really have answers to yet, because I'm only now really starting to like solidify what religions and deities are within Edirann and what they mean. I might end up doing a separate video on that, but I don't have good answers for that right now. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and leave it here with just the hugest thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if you like this video, please give it a like. I'm gonna see you in the next one.